Welcome to LNG. I'm Jamai Hakwani. Joining me for the conversation is candidate for Court of Appeals, Kerry Kiernan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We see you around the city. I think I've seen you a few times. I know you have a very extensive legal background there. We'll go into a little bit with how you started and things like that. That way, the individuals watching kind of get an idea of where you studied and things like that. And I think you went to school in UNM.
Right. My family moved out here when I was in grade school. They retired. My dad was a New York policeman, and we moved out here because of my mother's health. And so I've been here since 1968. Junior high school in Albuquerque, high school in Albuquerque, UNM undergraduate, and UNM law school. And I started to practice law in 1982.
So early 80s, right? And then
right.
I think you first started out with Court of Appeals judge.
Well, actually, that was my second. I was in private practice for a while, but I wanted to move to the Court of Appeals because I knew Judge Oliver was looking for a law clerk. So in 1984, I approached him about being his law clerk, and he said amazingly, sure, come on in. And I think that's where the love of the appellate process first became apparent to me.
Is there a process how you apply, just so the students watching, how do you just kind of apply, or is it an opening, or do they recommend you? Or?
It's not a recommendation as it is for judges, but I mean, you go to the judge, you resume, writing samples usually, and the judge usually advertises in like the bar bulletin or something like that. And I knew he was moving from the district court to the Court of Appeals, so it's an interview, it's a resume, and usually it's a writing sample.
So what was the appeal there as far as the Court of Appeals?
Well, you know, when writing and analysis have always been something I really loved, and legal research. And
so more into research during the college years?
During the college years, yeah, you're not obviously, you're doing some writing, like for advocacy class, but you're not doing judicial opinions. So I had a love of research and a love of analysis and writing, but, and I knew, or I thought I would have some ability at it. So what I did is I approached Judge Oliver, and I was fortunate enough because he let his clerks not only do legal research, but he would engage them in legal analysis. He would make the ultimate decision on a result in a case, but he would talk through his analysis with the clerks. And if you were really lucky, he would let you write sections of an opinion, which was a great learning experience. And then he would...
So it's a great hands-on experience.
Absolutely.
You were actually writing an opinion.
You were thinking, you were writing, and he would, of course, then change or reject or accept some of it and do his own, bring his own touches to it. But it really solidified my love of those three elements. But interestingly, what was also very important to me was looking at the judges on the Court of Appeals, it became quickly apparent to me that, gosh, they're making law, they're making policy, not only for the real people before them, but for the whole state. And judges and lawyers in the future are going to look at these decisions and opinions.
And it affects the whole state.
It affects the whole state. And it affects the whole state for years to come. And I said, boy, I love that responsibility. And I love the fact that they're giving that service to the state because they're a critical part of, you know, New Mexico. Some cases will go to the New Mexico Supreme Court, but most appeals stay with the Court of Appeals. And I said, I met my wife 29 years ago, and I said to her then, you know, I really want to be an appellate judge.
This was many years ago. They have 10 judges, just for the individuals watching. There are 10 judges on there,
10
correct?
judges.
And then they usually...
Panels of three usually decide the case.
But then a single judges hear cases, correct? Initial cases, and then they decide whether a third...
No, usually the cases are assigned to a panel of judges, okay. And one judge will become the author and disseminate his, you know, opinion to two other judges who decide to concur, or maybe there'll be a dissent. Generally, there's a concurrence. But
they always work in groups.
They work in groups of threes. Now, there will be oral arguments sometimes where the three judges who are doing the case will hear the lawyer come in and speak about his position. Okay. But that's not frequent anymore in the Court of Appeals because of the
How was that decided to have 3 judges there? Why not 5?
You know, I don't know the history of that, but I mean the court...
But it's in our Constitution,
yeah,
right?
the court built up over time, you know. It started with 3 judges, and finally it became 10 judges. The Supreme Court, of course, is 5 judges, and has always been, you know, heard cases in that thing.
I thought they would, in my opinion, I thought they would probably follow the Supreme Court, but this is unique in that sense.
That is unique, yes. Yeah. And of course, their caseload is greater than the Supreme Court's because essentially most appeals come directly to them.
I think they're looking at about 1,000 cases every month, I think? Or?
No, they dispose of about 800 to 900 a year. Yeah, and I think the percentage is about 62% civil and about 38% criminal cases.
Correct. And they're coming out of the district, right? District
courts or metropolitan courts, right. And so they will be the reviewing court essentially. And for most people, I mean, that's the end of the road. I mean, some cases, as I say, can go to the Supreme Court, but for most people, that's the end of the road. And when I was clerking at the court, I made a decision. I said, you know, I'm going to try to structure my practice so that I get as much experience in the trenches as I can with clients and with the appellate process. And so I've represented people who sue and people being sued across the course of my career. And I've done simple cases like simple slip and falls, complex commercial, class actions, constitutional issues. And I've done criminal appeals because after I left Judge Allered, I worked as an appellate public defender for 2 years from 1980.
What was that like? Coming from the Court of Appeal in your...
That was great because then you got to be an advocate and you got to deal with very significant issues, search and seizure, right to counsel, you know, all of those great...
So the cases you were coming across were mostly search and seizure? But they're multitude of cases,
No, there are
right?
a multitude of cases, but there are, you get a lot of constitutional issues because of the Fourth Amendment problems, Fifth Amendment problems, Sixth Amendment problems. And I did about 40 appeals in that period of time and learned a great deal about, you know, those principles of criminal law.
I see. Anything that stood out to you in the public defender as far as Court of Appeal? Was there something that...
My first oral argument in front of the Supreme Court was a capital murder case, Johnny Zinn, who was convicted of kidnapping and raping a UNM undergraduate with 3 or 4 other people. And it was a very big case because it was based on the prosecutor had entered into plea agreements with some other defendants. And those defendants agreed to testify against Johnny Zinn. And so the question was, were those agreements coerced or not? And so I had to go to the Supreme Court. That was my first oral argument in a murder case. So that was a lot of pressure, you know, but I learned a great deal on that.
It gives you a great deal of experience from that point.
It gave me a great deal of experience. I mean, when your first case is a murder case and, you know, there's so much riding on it, you prepare, you try to get as much of a background on the law as you can. And since that time, I've appeared countless times in front of both the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court.
Right, yeah.
And I've been fortunate enough, if you don't mind me saying it, to become an appellate practice specialist, and there are only 8 lawyers like that in the state. And the best lawyers...
So you have to get a certain amount of appeals cases before you can actually...
Yes, and a certain amount of time spent in your practice before doing that. So I was first certified, I think, in 2005, and I was recertified. As I say, I've done a broad range of almost every conceivable civil appeal. And when I was doing the criminal appeals with public defender, that ranged from misdemeanors to felonies to the capital murder case that I talked about. But one thing that I think is important when a judge takes on the Court of Appeals is when you're a lawyer and you've been a lawyer for all those years, you understand that litigation is one of the most stressful things on your client, whether he's suing or being sued, or whether she's suing or being sued. And I think the lawyer's job is to try, to the best he can, or she can, find a way to do a quick and fair resolution of the case. Because your client, it's a very difficult process. It's like divorce or, you know, terminal illness. It's very, very stressful. And as a lawyer, I'd like to be able to bring that to the Court of Appeals because judges clearly have to remember that they're not this abstract intellectual, you know, institution. They're really dealing with the real lives of real people.
I think well, obviously you have a pretty extensive experience there. We'll talk a little bit more. Let me take a short break. We'll come back. We'll go more into some, if you want to talk about a specific case, we can. If not, then we can move on to some of the other things that you did.
Sure, thanks.
Well, we'll take a short break and we'll be right back.